Kentville and Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. On this day, National Indigenous Veterans Day, first commemorated in 1994, it is a Memorial Day observed in Canada in recognition of Aboriginal contributions to military service, particularly in the First and Second World War and the Korean War. My name is Una Proudfoot, and I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Affairs in the Office of Advancement at Acadia. And it is my pleasure to welcome our guests and take time to celebrate alumni who are working toward equitable community recreation through research and practice. Before we get started, though, a few housekeeping items. I've already mentioned it a couple of times, but just a reminder to please keep yourselves muted and your cameras disabled during the presentation piece, or as our speakers are beginning at the beginning of the session. A lot of background noise that we're not necessarily aware of happening behind us in our homes and in our lives. Just down the hallway are the bathrooms. Just kidding. It's been a while since I cracked that joke, so I thought I'd do it again. We'll also ask you, if you have questions, you can either write them in the chat function, and I'll keep an eye on the chat function and pose the questions to our speakers for you, if that's your preference. But we certainly do encourage all levels of engagement, so please feel free to turn your cameras on and your microphones and ask questions throughout. What you can do is either turn your camera on and raise your actual hand, or you can also raise your virtual hand, and I'll keep an eye out for those as well. And then the last piece of housekeeping is we put all of your names in for a draw. Earlier today, we celebrated 20 years of the K.C. Irving Environmental Science Center and the Harriet Irving Botanical Gardens. In honor of the anniversary, this book was published, A Natural Balance, which celebrates the 20th anniversary of the K.C. Irving Environmental Science Center and the Harriet Irving Botanical Gardens at Acadia. We are delighted to offer this as our draw prize for this evening's winner. Among other things, it is a showcase of over 17,000 native plants from the Acadian forest region. Learning about these plants is the #1 way that we can conserve them. So let's begin. Joining me this evening are Dr. Mary Sweatman, class of 03 and 19, Associate Professor in Community Development at Acadia. Dr. Jackie Oncescu, class of 2003 and 06, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology at UNB, and Lydia Broderick, class of 19, Active Living Community Coordinator for the Town of Kentville Parks and Recreation Department. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each of them to you, and then I'm going to hand it over to each of our speakers to do a bit of an intro, a little bit more about who they are and how they've ended up where they are on this session this evening. So Dr. Sweatman lives, works, and plays in Mi'kma'ki and is the mother of 2. She is an associate professor in community development at Acadia. As a community engagement scholar practitioner, her teaching and research interests include community campus partnerships, experiential learning, and equitable community spaces. She is currently involved in community action research on local food hubs, rural and small town homelessness, and recreation provisions for rural low-income families. Mary is also the faculty coordinator of Access Acadia, an inclusive post-secondary education option for people who identify with intellectual disabilities. Dr. Oncescu is an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology at UNB. She has a bachelor and master's in recreation management from Acadia and a PhD in human kinetics, focused on leisure studies and community development from the University of Ottawa. Jackie's research interests focus on 2 areas of study: rural community development and access and inclusion. Her research has explored rural community restructuring and the impacts to rural residents' lives, recreation's role in community resilience, and the role of community recreation delivery systems in supporting community social and economic change. Her most recent work is focused on poverty and community recreation and sport, with specific projects exploring how to create more accessible and inclusive sport and recreation delivery systems for citizens living with low incomes. And Lydia Broderick is our third panelist, a community development graduate from Acadia who is passionate about environmental and social justice, community wellness, and outdoor recreation. Lydia is the Active Living Community Coordinator for the Town of Kentville Parks and Recreation Department, and her role in this position is to respond to the increasingly diverse needs and opportunities available to the community surrounding recreation. Lydia also works for Girls on Boards, a body-positive stand-up paddleboarding nonprofit organization. Through Lydia's academic, professional, and personal experiences, she has ignited a passion for bringing awareness to the importance of providing equitable access to recreation. So wow, powerhouse of a panel joining us this evening, and thank you so much to the three of you for joining us and sharing your time with us and telling us a little bit more about what all of that means and what each of your roles are in it, and also your collaboration amongst the three of you. So if it's okay with each of you, what I'd love to do is start by offering each of you the opportunity to take a couple of minutes, tell us a little bit about who you are, in addition to what I've just shared from your first voice, where you and how you've landed where you are, and a little bit about the collaboration on the work that you're doing. Without letting too much out of the bag, I guess, because we'll end with Jackie, who I think is going to do a little bit of a segue into this work that we're specifically going to talk about this evening. And then we've got questions that we've collected from our attendees, as well as offering up the opportunity for folks to get engaged in the conversation. So Mary, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thank you, Una, for that lovely introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I appreciate your time and you tuning in online to be with us. I guess, without going into too much detail, I came to this topic and this area because of a passion for community and recreation and equity. And so bringing those all together and working really closely with Kentville Recreation, so Lydia and Rachel Benningfield, who may join us at some point this evening, which would be great. I've been teaching in the Department of Community Development, which was the Department of Recreation Management, which is what I graduated from in 2003 with Jackie and Rachel a year before us. And I've been teaching in this department for 10 years and have seen it evolve quite a bit, but with this clear intention around equity in our communities. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk about that, specifically around recreation, which is my passion. And I'm sure I will add more to that during it, but I'll keep that short because I think I'd like to get to those questions. Lydia, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I'm Lydia Broderick, and my preferred pronouns are she, her. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for tuning in, and I feel really lucky to be sharing the screen with the others here with me. So yeah, to also try to keep it short and sweet, I guess. It kind of started when I transferred into the Acadia Community Development Program, which I could rave on and on about, but I don't want anyone to think I'm making a commission off of this, and I do also want to get into these questions. But yeah, I guess prior to being immersed in that program, I had a pretty skewed perception of what recreation is and the breadth of impact that it can have. So through my time in the program, and then after graduating and working with Girls on Boards, and now the town of Kentville, I'm so passionate about recreation and everything that it can do. It did take me a little while to kind of figure out that that's the direction that I wanted to go into, but with some really great guidance and engaging courses at Acadia, it made me realize, you know what, this is something that I'm passionate about, and it's really, I'm just happy to be here. I don't know if that was a good way to introduce how I ended up here, but I will pass it off to Jackie.
That was really good, Lydia. Yeah, I'm kind of with Mary and Lydia, like a strong passion for recreation and the impact on community. I grew up in a rural village in Saskatchewan, and I think that part of my work is always, the rural work has always been a part of something I've really grew up with and saw the appreciation and value in. But I also have a deep sense of appreciation for the families and the citizens that don't have equitable access to these benefits that come from recreation that we're all passionate about. Having family interactions in and out of experiences in and out of poverty also drives the work that I do, and the right to play in Canada is a little trickier, as it feels more and more like it's a privilege to play, or the right to pay to play. And that really gets me fired up. It gets all of us fired up. And so I think just over the last decade, my work's just been evolving in exploring communities that have been disadvantaged by their rural location, like the geography. 18% of our population lives in rural, but they're disregarded in a lot of our research, and even into today's discussion around COVID, we saw a lot of missing discussion on policy and programs for rural communities. So yeah, it's been a journey, and it's been one project at a time learning. But my work, like Mary's, is tied closely to community. So my research only really happens with community partners, such as the town of Kentville. I've worked with other municipalities, but to me, that's the most exciting part about research that we do, is that we get to try out things in community for community with community, which I guess is kind of the best segue, Una, into this project.
And that's absolutely wonderful, Jackie, and the three of you combined have now got me fired up on the topic in the conversation. And full disclosure for everyone who's watching, all four of us graduated from the same program. So I don't want to kind of slip into rec speak and community speak without bringing all of our participants along with us. And there are also lots of rec and community development folks in the audience, but I'm sure several of whom are not. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask the question, just to sort of bring everybody to the same page. What does equitable access look like? So we've already started talking about equitable access to recreation and play. But for folks who don't necessarily know what that means, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I'll just toss that out to whomever would like to give us sort of the Coles Notes version on what that means and what it looks like. Go ahead.
Do you want to go? Okay, I can start it off. Well, to me, kind of what drives my work and what I believe to be equitable access to recreation is recreation that not only everyone in the community is able to attend and to get to. So that's considering all various barriers, whether that's how they're going to get there, how they're going to hear about it. Maybe other things that may come up along the way that can prevent them from getting there, but to provide them with recreation opportunities that they actually want to be at, so that they're desirable. So not just accessible in the sense of, making sure that they're able to get there and afford it, and feel comfortable there, but actually like enjoy themselves and want to come back and feel like it's a meaningful opportunity for them. So eliminating those barriers and ensuring that it is accessible, we'll probably touch on a lot throughout this presentation. It's pretty complex, but that doesn't discount for the fact that it's absolutely essential to do. So yeah, but I'll let Mary and Jackie chime in too.
Thank you, Lydia.
That was great. That's really helpful. I think that the thing I would add, and it helps me to understand equity, is that diversity and inclusion are outcomes, and that equity is a process. And I learned this from one of my close community partners that I'm working with a lot right now, which is the Valley African Nova Scotian Development Association. And that's a principle that they follow, that, we know we've gotten somewhere when people are included and they have access, but equity is a process, and that we should always be reflecting on our equity principles and practices in order to get there. So I often think of it that if everything's equal, then not everyone's going to have the same the same rights and the same opportunity to do well. And so equity then evens out that playing field so that we're all starting from the same basis, which, that's a metaphor. It's really hard to make that actually happen.
Absolutely. Anything else to add, Jackie?
No, well, yeah, maybe I'll add one thing to build on Mary's. Sometimes we talk a lot about social inclusion and belonging, and they kind of get as we think about those concepts. Diversity is an outcome. Sense of belonging, that where someone feels they belong, is also an outcome. And social inclusion is tied to equity in terms of, like, we have to change our policy and programs. It's like the sidewalk to the end. Like if we're thinking of it like, okay, everyone to the playground, we have to change the path or that process and those policies and the programs, and we have to address the inequities that exist on that path to those outcomes, whatever they are, for whatever setting people are in.
And so appreciate your comment, Mary, that, or maybe with Jackie, sorry, that, you know, it's great to sort of understand it and say it, but it's a big process and a big, you know, sort of unruly world to try to get places in. So certainly so beneficial, sorry, to have each of you working on this, which brings me to my next question. How did the three of you connect on this project, and how did you come together and start working together? I'm gonna start naming who's gonna be answering.
I know, I was like, Jackie, you should take, do you want to start?
So long story short, I was in contact with Rachel prior to the pandemic, and we've been talking about community development and leisure education. And we've been always kind of trying to find the right time to implement a project with the town. And then coinciding with that, I had been invited to do some guest lecturing in Mary's class pre-pandemic on leisure education and the work I've been doing in Manitoba with a nonprofit organization out there on leisure education with families that are living in low-income circumstances. And after that presentation, or that time on campus at Acadia, and this was just weeks before the pandemic, Mary and I kind of said, you know, we should do a project together, because Mary teaches the same class as I do at Acadia. And then that was kind of it. And on my side of things, that's the most recent. When the pandemic hit, Rachel and Lydia reached out to Mary and I, and we started helping them kind of sort out how to move some of their delivery systems forward, like within the pandemic. But while that's happening, Mary also has a significant role, and I'll pass this off to her, with community organizations that has been ongoing that also kind of leveraged how we got into this project. So that's kind of my piece, how I got to this. Maybe Mary, I'll pass it to you to highlight your stuff that you brought into this project. Sure.
Yeah, mine's pretty on the ground that the pandemic hit, and I'm quite involved with a mom's group called Moms in Motion, and I've been the chair of this small little board for since I've been here, so 10 years. And Lydia's on that board as well, and so we work really closely with our community partners. And it's a once a week group for moms specifically who are having babies or just had babies, and it's an opportunity to share food, be together in recreation, pretty much in the community. I could talk for the whole hour about that organization, so I won't. But what happened when the pandemic hit is that we realized that a lot of our moms in that group were in crisis, and all of a sudden we're socially isolated and having trouble accessing food. And interestingly, food wasn't, the community was like, what can we do? What can we do to help? And the issue was getting the food actually to their door. And so I just started working with Kids Action, literally driving food around, collecting it from neighbors who wanted to donate. And then realizing that a lot of community partners, a lot of people were trying to do this, and we were all kind of, doing the same thing and overlapping, and we needed to work collectively. And that's when, then I'll pass it over to Lydia, because I think that's when Kentville Recreation started to do some really amazing things that we'll talk about more. But Lydia, I'll pass it to you.
I can't actually specifically remember how I got involved in this, but it definitely was Rachel, knocking on my door and being like, we have this opportunity, which is how most of my days start. And it's one of my favorite parts about working here is, just Rachel getting me really excited about working with Mary and Jackie and the rest of the team on this. And it kind of all started, one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that we had this opportunity to kind of, pause, not for too long, and think and yeah, think about how we can redesign our delivery system. We were talking a lot about how we can play that small role in enabling our community and its members to become more resilient, but we also talked about how we could become more resilient as a department. And that kind of started with just acknowledging, that although we are working hard to do better and to serve our community in a way that's more impactful, that there's a lot of things that we need to change and a lot of work to be done. So we kind of, we kind of just acknowledged that, accepted that there's a lot of gaps and what we're doing, and that there's a lot of things that we need to change. And this was the perfect opportunity to kind of work collectively and have a team to support that and come together to continue to move in the right direction and a better direction for our community. So, yeah.
Really appreciate that perspective, Lydia. Sorry, Jackie, over to you.
I just wanted to jump back in with Lydia's point. Is one of the things that we did early on, I think it was March 2020, Rachel and I ended up doing a presentation for CPRA on the ways that they were reimagining their provisions during the pandemic. And we had focused with Rachel and Lydia, and this is when Mary's work came into it, was that there's so many inequities with the way that rural communities were being or how rural communities had to respond to the pandemic, particularly around technology. And so we knew that there was families that didn't have access to recreation services on a non-pandemic day. So we really had to think of a model of delivering services. And so Rachel and Lydia's team put into like experiment mode and focused on community development work, which Mary brought to the table with the partners with Mums with Motion. And we have a few other organizations, but they also focused on leisure education, which is really important to highlight, is that their role became about educating people on where to engage in leisure and to maintain some well-being or cultivate it, but also how to get these services specifically to families that are marginalized socially, economically, geographically, in terms of ability, race as well. So it was kind of all of that kind of came together with the town being a willing, like, I guess, provider to try these new things. And it's been really well received from the research side of things.
And that actually just completely builds on the one point that I wanted to draw from what Lydia said, and when you said the silver lining from the pandemic, and as somebody who lives in the community, not directly involved with recreation and community development, directly, but seeing it around me, how the pandemic really created an opportunity or presented an opportunity for folks to, I think, begin to further understand what leisure and recreation are and what they look like and how important they are in our wellness. It's unfortunate that it took a pandemic, to sort of get some folks to kind of go, oh, okay, so this is important, and that community connection and that community development is critical if we're going to keep each other safe and well and process through this. So some of you have touched on it, certainly, but I'm going to purposely pose the question in case there's more that you'd like to add. And that's, where did your passion for recreation as a tool for community equity originate from? So certainly there was some snippets in each of your intros and a little bit about sort of how you landed here, but just offer it up as an opportunity to add any other points that you'd like to make. Lydia?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's interesting. And I mentioned this before, that I had a bit of a different perspective and toward recreation before my degree. I even remember not even considering studying community development, and my mom went on the tour for me for that while I went off and was on the psych tour, and she came back and she was like, this is for you. And I was like, Mom, you can't change the world running programs at a swimming pool or in a hiking trail. Like, that's not what I want to do. And it wasn't until I was actually, and the great thing about the community development program was I had these hands-on opportunities, and I also made these connections on campus and got involved in these other programs and extracurriculars where I could actually see, you know, this impact that community recreation truly can have, not just on other people, but I also was able to reap the benefits personally. In school, I kind of didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I didn't have that sense of belonging at first. On campus, I just was like, who am I? What do I want to do? And then it wasn't until I really got involved in some of these recreation opportunities that I was like, oh, okay, like this is what this is all about. I felt that sense of connection with other people, that sense of connection with myself, and I gained that stronger sense of belonging and that feeling of purpose. And yeah, I made connections with people who made a major impact on me and still do, and also had experiences that have had a lasting impact. So yeah, so I definitely experienced that personally in a time where I've had a very privileged life, and I never really felt like I struggled, but I did a little bit during that time with just trying to, you know, like feel like I belonged somewhere, and from that there were a tremendous amount of other benefits just from, you know, becoming involved with community recreation. And so then I think one other piece to that is just realizing, you know, I had a lot of opportunity, and there wasn't a lot of barriers in front of me to be able to do that, whereas there is for other people. And I've had people close to me in my life that have been presented with those barriers and still do. So that's definitely what motivates me, is, you know, being able to experience that positivity that came from that, but then also just realizing that it wasn't, if it hadn't been like kind of who I was in that moment, I may not have had those opportunities. So how can I make sure that other people do? Yeah, I guess that's kind of what drives me, and a whole bunch of other things and things that I continue to discover through my work. And whether it's like kids running down the hill waiting to collect equipment from me, like so stoked, or just conversations that I have with community members. I show up every day and I learn something new, and it kind of just, you know, adds another flame to that fire that, you know, that continues to drive me to do what I do. So yeah, I don't know if that answers that.
It does, Lydia. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Jackie or Mary, anything to add?
What she said.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, listen, it's a good segue into a question that I'll pose specifically of you, Mary. What role does research have in supporting community recreation practice, specifically when addressing inequities?
That's a big question. Did we write that? So research, for me, I think for our team, and certainly for the shoulders of the people that I stand on that have taught me these things, like Brenda Robertson in the room, who I would be remiss to not mention, give a shout out to Brenda from, I think, Jackie and I, because I don't think we'd be here without her, is that how we define research is it's an action oriented. So the reason for action is for change, for affecting change, for being part of a movement. And so for us, I think recreation research is really around partnership, and community action research is what we would call it, or what we call it in the work that we're doing right now, which means that it's centered around community questions, community interest, community problems, and community motivation. And so our work was a call to action from the town of Kentville Recreation Parks and Department. And I notice now that Rachel Bedingfield is on the call, and we've been mentioning her name, but she is the Director of Parks and Recreation in Kentville. And so Lydia and her work closely together. And so our work around research was a call to action from their department, as well as other community partners, in an effect to make change. And so I think that's really why I do what I do, and what motivates me. So when I hear that there are issues, there are things to collaborate on, then I'm all about that. And I think like recreation is a space for creativity and action, which is one of the things I love about it, is that it's not defined And often it gets overlooked sometimes when we're coming together to solve major problems in community like COVID. But that's one of the things I love about Rachel and Lydia, is that they're knocking on the door saying like, we need to be here, include us in these conversations. And then their wisdom in also saying that, well, we're doing this thing, well, we're knocking on doors and trying to make a difference. We also want some researchers in the room tracking the process and telling us how we're doing on it. So there's an evaluation and assessment piece to research too that I think is really important as we're doing these things, to watch it and to ask questions and to tell the stories of what's happening. So, you know, that's sort of how I would explain it. I don't know if Jackie wanted to add anything.
So Mary, just to kind of keep going on that, earlier in the conversation, it was mentioned that you know, the barriers that are excluding folks from recreation and opportunities such as wellness and play and the whole gamut. If they're missing from the opportunity, how does the research? How do we engage them so that we get the information through the research so that we can better the situation? How does that work?
Sure. So one of the first things we did when we were applied for some research funding through HAAWK, which is a federal funding agency for social studies and humanities. And when we received that funding, the first thing we did was we put together a community advisory committee. And this is made up of community members. Lydia and Rachel were on this, as well as members of different organizations that serve the population that we were looking at, which is low-income moms and their families. It also had representatives that were the moms who also were part of that community board. And we had representation so there was about, I think there was eight of us usually on this, and then we would meet once every few weeks. We met quite a bit. And their role was really to guide our research. And so we would ask them, you know, they were part of vetting our research questions. They were part of deciding how we would disseminate all the way to disseminating the results. And so that's a really important piece of community action research, which really guided what we did. So I think that answers part of the question around how do we ensure that we're including different or diverse voices. Another part is us telling the stories of the people that are lived experience. And so we interviewed 29 moms during our research, as well as community organizations, but I'll focus on the moms. So these were people who identified as being low income rural moms in the area. There were a handful of the moms who identified as Black or African Nova Scotian, a handful that identified as First Nations, Métis or Inuit, handful that were first new arrivals, newcomers to the community, and there were many who identified with having disabilities or their children having disabilities of some sort. And so we really worked hard to make sure that that group of 29 was diverse, and our community advisory committee really helped us to find those moms. And so we could keep telling the same story about, you know, about community that just asks the same question to the same people. But as researchers and working closely with community, we knew that you can't do that. You have to find as many voices as possible. And then you take all of those narratives, all of those interviews, and you try to come up with some commonalities, some themes, and also recognizing that there's outliers and that those tell a story as well. So that's sort of how we tried, and hopefully with some success, to tell the story of a diverse group of low-income rural moms and their experiences during COVID. And I think what's really important too, and this might not be totally related, is that COVID didn't create these issues for these moms. They just highlighted what was already happening. And I think that's really for me, the biggest story to tell, is that in some ways, these moms this was just an opportunity to tell their stories of their experiences that they've been experiencing for a long, long time. And that it's kind of like shaking our institutions to say, our systemically oppressing institutions, that we need to do something to make sure that these moms and their families have access to transportation, to technology, to the internet, to things that really isolated them from the community, even more so during COVID. That might have been a tangent, Una. Sorry about that.
Not at all. I mean, great information that's sort of trying to, kind of bringing the story along. And so the next question is to you, Jackie, because and then I want to keep reminding folks to use the chat function to ask your questions if you have them. Maybe a little nerve-wracking for all of you that Brenda is on the line and she's probably preparing her first question. So, and Rachel, you have been mentioned several times, and I understand you're there. So please, when you're ready, and if you wouldn't mind, you can turn on your camera and say a hello. Take your time. Jackie, there she is. We've got the camera coming on. Hi, Rachel. How are you? Thank you for joining us. So, Jackie, can you describe some of the major findings of the project? Let's start to get into some of the detail so that we can generate some questions and some discussion from the folks listening in.
Oh my God, yeah. So to start, we should just describe the purpose of the study to begin with, which was to understand the impact that COVID was having on rural low-income mothers' capacity to facilitate leisure that would support their families' well-being during different stages of the pandemic. We chose this specific population because the pandemic was disproportionately impacting mothers and women more so than other economic recessions that have happened in the past, that have predominantly impacted industries where men typically are working. And we knew that there was a significant impact to the domestic and familial roles that women predominantly still in society are in charge of. Rural was missed in a lot of policy and discussion. So we know that rural families, and then if you're low income, that layers on a different challenge. And so in offering recreation services in these more rural areas, we have to think differently. And so our key findings were kind of categorized into the effects of COVID on the families. I'm just gonna, there's a lot, but I won't get into all of them. But and keep in mind that though I will describe these effects that the mothers experience, it is layered with multiple layers of oppression that are intersecting in their lives. So we all felt socially isolated. However, the families that we were working with have far fewer means to dealing with that. So there's an increase in social isolation and contact that the families experienced, increases in mental health around fear, anxiety, or fear and anxiety associated with affording and getting through the day-to-day, which tied into food insecurity that they were experiencing and how they were going to get food, particularly because traditional mechanisms that were in place in community were shut down. Access to transportation was challenging in the region. The bus system did shut down for a period of time. And if you don't have private transportation, you were really disadvantaged. There was families with children with disabilities, mothers living with different disabilities that compounded their capacity to manage the school and online learning environment, their health and well-being. Employment, instability in employment. A lot of the families talked about loss of income, reduced employment, and those challenges. Housing was also noted, insecure housing. Some mothers were dealing with eviction during this time. Some were locked up in apartments without backyards and spaces. Some weren't living in safe neighborhoods. We also had some talk about domestic violence. We also had families talk about the racism, and anyone, I know the timeline seems like a blur, but George Floyd happened during the pandemic. His passing away and the Black Lives Matter movement really came up in the news at the same time. And for some of our Black participants, that really created an added layer of vulnerability in the community and increased experiences of racism. Education. I imagine there's many mothers and fathers maybe listening. Educating at home was really problematic. Our families didn't have access to the technology or the data or the Wi-Fi, and that was a big outcome of rural, is inadequate internet access. And then even if you could afford it, or if you could afford it, it's not the best. And if you can't afford it at all, you were marginalized from your work or education or even community experiences during the pandemic. Transportation, I mentioned, childcare was a problem. Childcare was, needs were increased. Families had to make tough decisions around, working or staying at home because they couldn't afford childcare because their hours were reduced. So there's just so many complex layers of those that were specific to the families. Just like the other kind of key findings, though, were related to the provisions that Rachel and Lydia provided. One of the things that worked really well was the ease of access with dropping off recreation provisions and creating leisure education kind of play kits that help families cope with the stress of the pandemic. So we specifically were looking at how that impacted the families. The fact that they could phone or message them, and there's multiple ways to reach the department on how to take out equipment, get a play box, or connect with the staff was really highlighted. It made entertaining easier for the families, for the parents. It took the added pressure off of how they're going to figure that out on top of feeding, working, and educating their kids. It expanded their leisure activities and hobbies. Some of them picked up new activities like skateboarding. That was one that was mentioned in the interviews. They engaged in the community in different ways that they hadn't before, which was intentional by the staff on educating them where it was safe to go, what they could do in these areas. And that leisure ed piece really, everything we learned was phenomenal, but that education piece, I can't say enough, came through, which is really important, and the outreach. And then just the quality, there's so much more, but I'm just giving the short version. The quality of time together as families in these play experiences were super, super valuable. We saw an increase sense of family togetherness that was important, that buffered some of the stress of COVID. There was this desire for family programming that came through, and Rachel and Lydia did a really great job with that. There's other stuff that I know we can't get to today with the timing, but the collaborations that Rachel and Lydia did with the community organizations were really positive. That one of the biggest things that I will say Rachel and Lydia did well was they went on a mission to prove that they had a role in navigating this pandemic for their community, and they were front and center, and they worked with organizations that are not recreation providers, connecting with, doing work around food insecurity. We don't think of that as a role for recreation, but Rachel and Lydia found a way to show that they had a role to play, which was essential. And there's really unique ways that Lydia was able to merge food security with leisure awareness and education that got delivered to people's doorsteps through food boxes. And it just went to show that when you change the way you think about your work, you can change the way that experiences of the way leisure can be experienced in your community. And it wasn't through traditional means of delivery, and it can't be that way anymore. And so those were big highlights. And then there were some gaps. There were still some things that were challenging. One is addressing racism. Working with the BIPOC community and BIPOC community organizations continues to be challenging, and that's something that came up. Overlapping services came up as well, but generally speaking, there was enough gems in this research that we could see where we could make some movement and recommendations and just highlight some really important outcomes. So, oh my gosh, that's just the tip of the iceberg, but I hope that is enough.
Listen, that is a lot, and we look forward to more. So a couple of things here. I'm gonna segue over to Lydia and ask for a little bit more information on some of the initiatives that Jackie just mentioned. I think folks would be interested in hearing that, the play kits and any other ones that you'd like to highlight. I noticed while Jackie was speaking that Rachel was taking some notes, so I'm going to offer Rachel the opportunity to add in some comments or some observations or some experiences that you felt and that you contributed in the bigger conversation. And then we have our first question in the chat. So, Lydia, over to you to give us a little bit more detail on some of the initiatives in your department and in the town, and then we'll hand it over to Rachel for a bit. So, you first.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And to kind of build off of what both Mary and Jackie talked about before. Yeah. Kind of starting off as the pandemic began. Yeah, it just kind of amplified the already existing gaps that were there. And as we tried to kind of, adapt and figure things out, it was almost like a double-edged sword, kind of. We were like, okay, let's do some virtual stuff in an effort to include everyone, but actually it caused us to exclude people. So we kind of went back to the drawing board and we're like, okay, yes, this is a great way to serve some folks in the community, but what about everyone else over here who doesn't have access to this, who maybe doesn't want to do this option of recreation, who doesn't even know that we're offering it, let alone have the ability to tune in for it. So there were, I can't really remember the exact order of how things happened, but one thing that did, that kind of started to create a ripple was, meeting with Jackie and Mary and putting our heads together and talking about, this leisure ed piece and bringing these tools to folks. And then at the same time, we were also supporting Open Arms and helping to deliver food boxes. And during that time, and I was really just like a small volunteer and this big group of other folks who were doing a lot of work on that. But I had these conversations with people when I was dropping off food, and it was just really eye-opening. It was, I had one conversation with someone who said, oh, like I haven't seen someone face to face in like a week and a half. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, like COVID is really tough. And he was like, no, like that was normal before COVID. And so it just, it was that reminder that, just because this pandemic is causing things like social isolation and food insecurity, like this all existed beforehand. And all of these folks in the community were already being missed by what we were offering. So that's kind of why I mentioned earlier that silver lining in time to, redesign our system. So that was kind of the start. And then after having some conversation, trying a lot of things that kind of worked, didn't work. We really pushed ourselves not to be discouraged by that and to continue to kind of accept where our shortcomings were, but also areas to improve our work. And we landed on this idea of designing these recreation kits that had that leisure ed lens added to it. And they were essentially this kit that had a bunch of random stuff from bubbles to decks of cards to frisbees, and then like a 30-page manual that aligned with that kit. But these kits weren't just these things that we came up with out of nowhere. We worked closely with different community partner organizations, some of which include Kings County Family Resource Center, Portal Outreach, the list goes on. And we talked about, what would be helpful, what would folks benefit from having in these kits. So we made sure that there were things in there surrounding mindfulness activities, art, physical activity, and again, with that intention of people developing, kind of that understanding and that also that self-efficacy and confidence to kind of go out and try other things and to go out in new trails, and to be able to do things and to also add that personal connection piece was really important. Like they got a new kit every 2 weeks and we kind of, we checked in with them. The community partner organization hand delivered it to them. So they already had that relationship with that person, and then they expected another kit 2 weeks later. So that was one of our initiatives that was really successful. And I'd say that paired with our adapted equipment loan program, which was essentially us dropping off buckets of equipment to people's houses. That's when I talked about kids like running down the hill before you even had the opportunity to park your car, which was really special. That was also kind of that piece of, bringing recreation to people, and, helping them to find new fun ways to engage in recreation, and in ways that have low barriers and that can be done on their own. So, yeah.
Rachel, just before we get to you, my observation again, and I mentioned it earlier, is the level of passion in each of your voices as you describe this work is incredible. It's awesome to hear and heartwarming. Rachel, cameo appearance by Rachel Bedingfield, Director of Parks and Rec in Kentville. Please just chime in with some comments and observations from your time with this fine panel and the work that you're all doing.
Yeah, hello everyone. I apologize that I'm late, but I'm really happy to be here and even more happy just to listen because there's some brilliant women here. Una, when you said that you caught me making notes, I was actually trying to come up with a couple name for Lydia and I, because Jackie kept having to refer to Rachel and Lydia. So I was like Radia, Rachel. So then I was like, oh, I better write some real notes. Just to make it easier for her. Anyway, Lydia and I will talk about it and we'll get back to you. That I think, they've said everything that can be said. From our perspective in our department, we just didn't have a choice. It just wasn't an option for us to sit back and see the people who we had worked so hard to build relationships with just suffer more than we knew at the time. And then as we started to dive into it, we realized how desperate things had gotten. And to Jackie's point, before the pandemic. And, I remember the day that, Lydia and I both probably shed a few tears where we realized that, oh my goodness, our current delivery model is actually causing more division than it is good. And that's a really hard pill to swallow when you go into this profession and you that you're in it because you want to make a difference and you want to see smiles and you want people to come together. And so we didn't really have a choice, did we, Lydia? We just were like, okay, well, all we know is that what we're doing isn't working. So let's just kind of wipe the slate clean and we're going to go from there. And we just started making phone calls, to people in the community that we knew. How are you doing? We started listening a lot more, and I would say more intently. And then the more that we started listening, the more we realized, okay, well, we can put energy here. We can do this. And it wasn't even in tandem. I wouldn't even know where Lydia was half the time. She'd be off somewhere, standing on somebody's doorstep, talking about stuff, while I was in here trying to convince people that we needed more support and more funding. And then in the midst of it all, we knew that there was something that needed to be captured. And this is the benefit of partnering with institutions like Acadia and UMB, because, we have these two brilliant researchers who were able to capture the information, but also do it in a way, I have to say, that was really they were so giving to us. So, Jackie put this spreadsheet together that was really simple. It didn't require hours and hours of data input because she knew we didn't have hours and hours of data input. And when we were applying for the grant and writing letters of support, Mary would say, why don't I write the support letter? And you could just sign off on it. Things like that made such a huge difference for us because it was very rare that we had a moment to breathe. And I would argue we've only probably August of this summer we were able to breathe, I would say, for the first time. And it's been kind of a good go. The biggest piece is this idea that our traditional model has been designed to make it easier for us. So what does it look like if we put the people in our community in the center of that? And we talk a lot about decentralization. We're talking a lot now about building resiliency within community, within organizations that we work with. What does that look like? And we just continue to keep doing things and checking in. And now I'd say we have time to kind of, Lydia and I can every now and then step back and say, how did that go? But in that moment when this research was happening, we would, okay, that didn't work. Okay, let's do this. All right, let's try this. Here, that worked. Okay, let's do more of that. Okay, it doesn't work anymore. Let's move here. And it was great. And our department, while other departments were cutting their staff, we ended up hiring extra staff because it just got so much that we needed help, because people were asking us for more than we had the ability to deliver. And it was great that all of a sudden they saw us as something that could help them out, which is a really great piece.
Thank you, Rachel. And I don't know that we can get through this entire conversation without using the word, but it sounds like there was a lot of pivoting going on.
Yeah.
Jackie, you had your hand up.
Just something to point out too, that one thing that Mary and I were able to help Lydia and Rachel with was like kind of being anchored in core principles. And this is what we talked about in March in our last presentation, was that we kind of like sat back and said, okay, the system, what we're doing now, I think we all agree needed to be done before and needs to be continued, and then some. But the department anchored themselves with kind of core principles. One was community development, which was empathy and understanding, and they changed the way that they interacted with community and worked with community organizations. The second was focusing on leisure education and ensuring that whatever they provided was around and centered on leisure education. And the third was addressing the inequities. So was the outreach. Like how do we, okay, if transportation's an issue, how do we address that? If food security is an issue, how are we playing a role in that? So they looked, and so that anchored like Rachel and Lydia to kind of just be like, okay, like when it came to this particular population, they kind of had this like kind of checklist of like, is this, are we educating them? Are we addressing the challenges of accessing it? Like, is it equitable? And are we hearing people and what they actually need versus them putting the kits together? They went to the source of the front line of organizations of youth or older adults and said, what would be valuable here? So I just wanted to draw attention to that. As scattered as Rachel, I think, and Lydia felt, we were able at the start to get them anchored into core principles that were positively received on the outcome, like in the research later on. There was some deliberate, I guess, intention behind what they were doing.
Thank you for that, Jackie. So folks, we are very quickly running out of time, sadly. Lots of information and lots more to discuss. There are a few questions that I do want to get to in the chat function. And then there's one final question for all of you that we need to get to before we call it an evening. So from Robin Norby, and certainly the question is, what are some of those specific community partner organizations? And you've mentioned Open Arms, you've mentioned Resource Center, but if there's a few more that you would like to mention to help answer Robin's question. Other organizations.
Chrysalis House and Great Beginnings. I'm trying to think of other ones.
The portal I mentioned, I'm not sure. Like even with the schools, that was really helpful, partnering with KCA. They have a good connection with a lot of families.
And you mentioned that as well.
Yeah.
Right. If you think of any others, just jot them in the chat function. That would be great. Next question is from Laura Fisher. She says, Lydia and Rachel, is there anything given the proposed research and feedback from the moms and partner organization focus groups in the instance of another lockdown in particular?
Before they answer that question, I have to give a shout out to Laura because she was one of our amazing researchers on this project. And we couldn't have done this work without her. So thanks, Laura, for tuning in.
And I am not surprised. This is not a look of surprise on my face. I'm not surprised for your question, Laura. So Lydia and Rachel, anything that add something that you might off that's coming right now?
It's getting a bit hard to hear you, Una, at least on my end, but I'll just go. I'm glad that you introduced her, Mary, because I was like, oh God, do people know who Laura is? That she's this brilliant woman and now she's posing questions, and that makes me nervous. But and she knows this research inside and out. I'll go first, and then Lydia, you can jump in. I think, so much of what we learned is taking the service to the people, taking recreation to the people, meeting people where they're at, where they're most comfortable, and that our department has a lot to do when it comes to filling those gaps, especially reaching out in the BIPOC population. There's still so much to do, which is another big thing. But there's more moments in time where I feel like we're onto something than there is not today.
I echo everything that Rachel just said, and also it's nice to have you here, Laura. You've played an amazing role in this whole thing. I would say definitely, I know you asked what we would do differently, maybe if we went into another lockdown and what we plan to do moving forward. Yeah, definitely. There's things that we would have done differently for sure now that we have this hindsight. But I would say engaging with community partner organizations, more of them sooner, earlier on. That was so important in the work that we did, as they were really well connected with a lot of the folks that we were trying to connect with. And also just like having really open conversations, more of those. We discovered a lot about how valuable just using play is as a tool for engaging with community, and literally just showing up in a park with lawn games can provide you with a lot more insight than sending out a survey on your Facebook page. So just, you know, having those conversations with folks, listening, connecting more, leading with empathy, all of those pieces. And also just, I think one thing that we did do, but definitely was a key learning to continue to do moving forward, is just like acknowledging when we're not doing the right thing, and just being okay with that, and accepting that there's lots of work that we can continue to do, and that the worst thing to do is to ignore that and to just kind of stick with the, just be complacent in what we're doing, and pretend that we're doing all that we can do. So just, yeah, accepting and acknowledging that.
Terrific. Thank you, Lydia. And folks, there are more questions popping up, as was guessed that would likely happen. So we're gonna take those questions down, and we're gonna do our best to collect that information and share it with folks who are attending this evening. Because as I said, I am cognizant of everyone's time and the commitment you've made to be with us this evening. So I'd like to finish off with a question to each of the panelists. And Lydia, you talked about the pandemic being a time to redesign our systems. Rachel, you talked about that sort of moment when you realized what you were doing wasn't working. So for the panelists, how will this research guide and inform your work in community recreation and research moving forward? So you've done all this great work, you've got this information that you barely scratched the surface on sharing with us this evening. What does it look like moving forward from today onward? We got precious time here.
Sure.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Lydia.
Okay, I'll be quick. Yeah, Rachel kind of touched on this, but that decentralization piece, we're trying to do more of that. Also with different lines of communication. Communication is something that definitely, we just realized how much that needs to be improved upon. There's no silver bullet or exact way that we're gonna strengthen that piece of our work, but we have tried some new things actually since the research was brought forward to us. So we have this new thing called rec text, which is a lot of people who were interviewed expressed that, you know, texting is the best way to keep them updated, so they don't have time to go on to Facebook all the time. So now people can sign up to be directly notified. So yeah, that communication piece, I think, just continuing to strengthen our relationships with community partner organizations, and to be able to just, you know, create more opportunities and create more space to have those conversations with folks in our community, all the while making sure that those spaces are ones that people want to actually come out to and enjoy, and so that we can talk to them, and to, I think, just continue to, you know, be really honest with ourselves and the work that we're doing, and to just continue to, just to work collaboratively with other folks. And there's a lot of other things, but those are a few.
That's wonderful, and you've got a heart in the chat function on the record text from Sally O'Neill. Mary, how about you?
Yeah, really quickly, I think for me it's around, as a researcher, continuing to research particularly with organizations that represent BIPOC populations in rural Nova Scotia. So really forging those relationships that have come from this research, and then asking them what questions do they want to be researched, and acting as a bridge or a tool to Acadia, and elevating our resources at Acadia for those organizations. And really quickly, I think it's about creative or critical hope right now for creative solutions that we find collectively. So to me, that's kind of like my driving force right now, about being critical but hopeful, and then looking for creative solutions together collaboratively.
And so wonderful to use that word, Mary. You know, when we were hitting some of the highlights from Jackie on your research findings, the finding hope. You know, it's a you often wonder. You know, so for you to say that moving forward, that's what we do. You know, you take the information, we have a better understanding because of the work that you've all done, and hopeful that we're moving forward in ways that we can find creative solutions. Absolutely, Jackie. What about you?
Yeah, I think one of them, the pieces is advocacy. So continuing to work with community organizations. You know, I often get asked a lot, can you do presentations to council? Like, how can we convince the folks with the purse strings or the wallets with, you know, to convince people of the benefits of recreation and why it's privileged? So for me, it's a big education piece at the system, and working with system players and organizations to address these inequities and exclusionary mechanisms, so that all people have access to leisure. And it's, for me, helping build capacity with organizations that are stretched. Most people probably here work in recreation or sport or leisure and nonprofits, and they're thin in terms of capacity. And I know Mary and I were able to bring resources from universities into community, that had, you know, creates more capacity to do this work. So it's just more of the same, another community, another organization, and more of this creative, critical work.
You know, and building on that advocacy work, Jackie, to your point about, you know, folks on the line and many being in recreation and community development and other organizations, regardless of what we do in our daily lives, we're all here and we're all listening, and we all have the ability to be part of a conversation and or generate a conversation wherever and whenever we can. So hopefully the 20 plus people, 30 plus people who've been listening to you this evening take that call to action piece as we walk away from this conversation. So folks, we're going to wrap up here. It just feels like we've just started to scratch the surface, but you know what, that's what research is, and that's what asking these questions is all about. We continue to ask the questions one question at a time, and seek that answer. You know, and it brings me back to the days of my research that I did, also under the direction of Dr. Brenda Robertson, how there's always a question. You take one question at a time. You take one piece of the puzzle at a time. And nice segue, actually, into the winner of the prize draw for the book, A Natural Balance, celebrating the 20 years of Casey Irving. And I promise this was done completely generally, just like I've done every draw for the last year, 2 years. The winner is Dr. Brenda Robertson. So we will get that book to you, Brenda. You are the winner of our prize draw this evening. So thank you, everyone who joined us to listen to the conversation. Thank you especially to our panelists for sharing your time, your expertise, your passion with us, and to Rachel as well for being able to join us and her cameo appearance, but also being a big piece of this this equation. So thank you to you all. Folks, we have another virtual event coming up in early December. Keep your eyes and ears open for that. And the recording for this discussion will be available and sent out very, very soon. Again, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And we hope to see you all soon. Take care.